Okay, welcome. Why don't we start with some introductions today? My name is Mike Chiarella. I'm a detective with the APD's Crisis Intervention Unit. And we'll start off by introducing our hub team today. I see Dr. Nancy Martin.
Hi, everybody. Nancy Martin, Presbyterian Psychiatry.
And we have Dr. Niels Rosenbaum.
Hi, Niels Rosenbaum, psychiatrist with APD.
And then we have our Sergeant Charles Crook.
Hey, Sergeant Charles Crook with Crisis Intervention Section.
And there's Detective Miera.
Hi, everyone. Shannon Mieta, Albuquerque Police Department, Crisis Intervention Unit.
And Detective Saavedra.
Detective Lawrence Saavedra, APD CIU. Hello.
And Detective Melendrez.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's Ben with CIU.
And we have Detective Garnand.
Hi, everyone. Rob Garnand, CIU.
And our project coordinator, Kimberly McManus.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kim McManus. I'm the project coordinator for Cit Echo.
And I think that's it for the hub team. We also have Detective Bailey with the Crisis Intervention Unit. She's going to be assisting me with the case study today.
Detective Bailey, CIU.
Right, and just a few more introductions. I'll just go down the line here. I have Kay Martin. Hi, Kim. Hi.
How's it going?
Good.
Lieutenant over the CIT team for Rio Rancho.
Nice, welcome. And Randy Sanchez.
Afternoon, everybody. Retired Major Randy Sanchez, Rio River County Sheriff's Office.
And Detective Padilla.
Hello. Sorry about your Browns, Ben.
All right, and I have a list here of some other people with no microphone today. We have Officer Morgan Franklin with APD and Detective Donna Richter with APD and Thomas Stoddard with APD. Lisa Chavez, part of our Coast team, and Yvette with Coast. And I'm logged on also. I'll give her a little formal introduction in a minute, but we have Dr. Lisa Herrera. And who else did I miss? I have so it's Captain Amber. Maybe no microphone. And I have.
Oh, yes, I'm here. Hello, everybody from Buffalo Police Department. Glad to be on.
Nice, welcome. And Christy Pfeiffer. With Boulder PD. They're part of their co-responder team. Welcome today. Okay. So some announcements for the week. This is the last Echo session of the year. We'll be back on January 5th with Dr. Crisanti, and she'll be talking about myth busting, suicide around the holidays. That will also be the first week that we're going to have a registration for Echo. So login might be a little different that first time. So just leave an extra minute or two when it's time to log in. And then also starting January 5th, we're going back to our weekly sessions instead of every other week. And those are all the announcements. So we're going to go into our case study. And like I mentioned, I have one of Detective Bailey's cases that she's been working, and so she'll be here to assist us with some collateral information if needed. We'll just use the first name. This gentleman's name is Ronald. He is a 61-year-old male. He lives in Albuquerque. He is an armed services veteran who served in the Marine Corps. He's diagnosed with PTSD, something that he's verified and also his family has verified. He's also listed as having a substance abuse issue. Back in 2013, he was known to use cocaine. Also in 2013, he was the subject of an officer safety bulletin where he was described as extremely aggressive as he confronted officers and made threats to harm them. On that day, 7 years ago, he was armed with numerous firearms. At the time, he was on a little one-person manhunt searching for an individual who he believed had sexually assaulted a 3-year-old boy. And he has also been known to threaten suicide. So in between 2013 and 2020, there was basically no referrals from field officers and no contact with the crisis intervention unit. Early spring of 2020, Ronald was panhandling at a convenience store and being disorderly and aggressive. And at that time, he was uncooperative with police and refused to sign the CT notice. And that's when it was documented that he was panhandling to get money for alcohol and drugs. Later that summer, Ronald was in an argument with his roommates that required the police to de-escalate that situation. Also that summer, Ronald became agitated. He approached a neighbor while armed with a large knife. On that day, he was transported to the Veterans Hospital for his care. Also, summer 2020, Ronald was arrested after he was armed with a hammer in the middle of the street and he was chasing passing vehicles. He initially refused to follow the commands of responding officers. Ronald was armed with 3 knives. One of them was described as being the size of a sword. Moving on to fall of 2020, Ronald was arrested after threatening his neighbor with a knife. He challenged the responding officers and force had to be used to take him into custody. So this winter, just gaining collateral information from his wife, we learned that Ronald was sober for 6 years with the help of the VA services. His wife describes this new aggressive behavior to be more from alcohol than drugs, but there is recent use of oxycodone and meth, and she says this started about a year ago. And now the family is facing eviction, and even though Ronald is eligible for numerous services and assistance programs, he's refusing help and is refusing to fill out any paperwork because he does not want to be in the system. The timeline for his arrest this year was the disorderly in November, then in September, another arrest for disorderly. And then he hasn't been arrested for roughly 17 years prior to that. And that's when he was impersonating an officer. And then a time before that, just again, refusing to obey and being disorderly. So that's a brief history on him. Our question to the network is, how do we assist the family when the eligible party is refusing any type of help? And I'm not sure which doctor wanted to do our debrief on that.
It's going to be me today. So, hey, everybody, it's Nancy Martin with Presbyterian. So before we get to that question for the network, let me summarize the case and then we can ask any clarifying questions. So the person that we're discussing today is a 61-year-old male. Sounds like he served in the Marine Corps, was diagnosed with PTSD, had some diagnosed substance use disorders dating back to around 2013. Sounds like first with cocaine and possibly alcohol, but did have 6 years sobriety at some point. But over the last year, multiple calls for service related to aggressive or disorderly behavior, and certainly acting aggressive with neighbors or strangers, and typically armed with a hammer or a knife. It sounds like he has some underlying paranoid delusional content, whether that's directed towards somebody hurting a 3-year-old boy, or being incorporated within a system, but that belief system is preventing him from engaging in services that are available to him as a veteran. Unfortunately, there's new onset methamphetamine and oxycodone use as well, and the family is now facing eviction. So any clarifying questions for our detectives? I have a couple. Again, it's Nancy Martin. Has he ever has competency ever come up within any of his legal interactions? Has that question ever come up?
His wife doesn't think so. She said he was successful, in his sobriety for that 6 years because she felt an incident with their daughter kind of pushed him to kind of get that help he needed. But in regard to like if he had ever had any sort of intervention in that regard, she doesn't know, and the VA doesn't share information with anyone.
And a question in the chat: is a mental health or veterans court a possibility? In my county, charges can be directed to these type of specialty courts and they can mandate treatment.
So the wife said she would really like for him to get in this program that they had originally tried to set him up for through the VA, which is called the CORE program. But that initially he agreed. But when he went in, he was so agitated and aggressive that they gave him an antipsychotic and said, okay, we'll give you 24 hours to, comply, basically. After that 24 hours was up, he was still agitated and upset and dropped out of the program. And now he doesn't trust the VA. He doesn't trust based on that incident, he doesn't want to participate in the CORE program, but apparently it's like a 5-month inpatient treatment. And she knows he responds to treatment well because he has in the past, and he was 6 years sober. But now there's this distrust with the VA. I did, because he does have 2 misdemeanor warrants pending right now for petty, panhandling, failure to appear stuff. So I am working right now with Priscilla Demas and the AOT program, and they are currently screening him for the AOT program through the courts. And his wife is hopeful that if they get some sort of intervention that he could possibly respond well. Our biggest concern right now is that every incident in the recent past that he's been involved in, he's agitated, upset, he's resisted arrest, which has caused a use of force. And every time he's armed with knives, he's threatening neighbors with knives, but it's unknown what is causing this aggression in him other than the alcohol or the drugs. for whatever reason, she thinks it's the alcohol more than the drug.
Another question from the network is, are there any other medical diagnoses or possibly a TBI?
No, the only thing she told me was the PTSD from the military, but she doesn't know specifically what the PTSD is from or what triggers it or anything like that. She did say too, although she doesn't know if he's diagnosed with it or not, he has been to the hospital, but they won't share information with her. So there could be other things there that he just hasn't told her about, but she said he has really bad anxiety as well. But when they moved not too long ago, she said she thinks what triggered it was him finding the bottle of oxys. And ever since then, he's just gone downhill to the point she had to move in with her daughter and won't tell him where she's living. They are supposed to be out of the house by the end of this month. And she fears he's going to be homeless. But she's staying with her daughter and she's too scared of him to even let him know where she's staying right now. Although she didn't say anything about domestic violence or
Bailey, if you could run over the past violent offenses and then the pending charges.
Okay, so going through the background that I did on him when I received him, I went back to July of 2013. And there wasn't really anything until in regard to the violence until June of this year. So going all the way back to then, it wasn't till June of this year where he had an argument with some of his roommates. The officers came. He was agitated with them, upset, but the officers were able to de-escalate him. But during their interaction with him, they didn't specify, but the report said struck the officer twice on his wrist and his belt line. Apparently it wasn't bad enough to where he wasn't charged. But the incident wasn't forwarded to us, so we weren't aware of that one. Then in July, just a month later, in July of this year, neighbors had called reporting that he was continually causing disturbances in the neighborhood, yelling and trespassing on their properties. He had gone to this particular neighbor's house and was yelling at him. So that the neighbor just said he wanted Ronald to leave him alone. So when officers engaged with Ronald, he had a knife in a sheath behind his back. He placed the knife on the ground, and at that time they were able to convince him to go to the VA hospital. But they noted, again, they didn't go into detail, but they noted that he was, quote, extremely aggressive and confrontational with officers. But again, they didn't specify. Then in September of this year was when he was arrested for disorderly conduct. And that was the incident when he was out in the middle of the street in his neighborhood with a hammer yelling at cars. Then when officers arrived, eventually he followed their commands and they were able to get him into custody. And that's the time where he had 3 knives on him, the sword type knife and a folding knife. And he was arrested on that situation without incident. Then November last month, he was arrested again for disorderly and resisting. And in that incident, he had threatened another neighbor with a knife. That one, well, maybe it's that one or the next one, but he was armed with a knife at the time of that incident as well. And they were able to take him into custody. But the one, I mean, that was the most concerning was this most recent one that occurred this month. Once again, armed with a knife, threatening a neighbor in his driveway with the knife, trying to get the neighbor to open the car door. And when officers arrived and confronted him, he actually held the knife up over his head. Luckily, he didn't close the distance on the officers, but he set the knife down quickly. But then he picked the knife up again. The officers had to draw their weapons a couple of times. But again, they used their de-escalation skills. They were able to de-escalate him, get him to drop the knife long enough to get him into custody. But my fear and his wife's fear, this obsession with knives and whatnot, and whatever his issue with his neighbors are, he's going to confront somebody with a knife or an officer and potentially get seriously injured. And but in regard to getting him services, he's just resistant.
Any other clarifying questions? Okay, so then we can move on to the question for the network, which is how do we assist the family in getting Ronald some help?
Lawrence Savejo with APDCIU. Something that I thought about is, Casey, have you guys tried the Veterans Justice Outreach Program, Camila Lopez? She might be able to assist with him and also the family. She comes and teaches with us for the 40-hour CIT class, and she deals mostly with people that are in jail, out of jail, on probation. But I think that she would be able to help a little bit. There are programs for PTSD. I'm not sure if it's at this VA or they send them to Arizona, but they may be able to, if you think it's PTSD related and drug, they may be able to help with that. But I can give you her cell phone number and you can call and talk to her. I think she'd be valuable for this one, and she can help the family as well.
That sounds perfect. Thank you for that. I will definitely hit her up because he has an issue with the core program and the beacon program at the VA. So maybe something new will help.
Hey, Casey, I have something too. If they're VA resistant, he would probably be a very good client for our LEAD program. And it doesn't have to be any pending charges. It can also be a social contact referral. And it's intensive case management, and they also do inpatient and outpatient services.
What other recommendations? I have one, Detective Bailey. So I think this would be one of the cases where if competency has not been brought up when he has gone to court in the past, I think the family petitioning for emergency guardianship would be probably helpful. And I can forward the paperwork to you. Unfortunately, in New Mexico, it's a rather lengthy process. But you know, in the way that the case was presented today, his behavior and drug use and underlying paranoia is really getting in the way of not just him being housed, but his wife as well. And you know, I'm not sure who's managing his funds, but that's kind of a way for there to be another boundary in place. I don't know if he's the one collecting on his VA benefits, and then that's leading to his access to purchase, substances or alcohol. So that might be both, guardianship in terms of making decisions, but guardianship of his financials might be helpful. So I can forward you that paperwork.
Yes, thank you. And just to clarify, he does not receive any, he doesn't receive SSI. She said he even qualifies for SSDI, the VA benefits and all that, and he doesn't receive any income whatsoever because he, in regard to the VA, he's scared that, apparently from what she says, that if he files for any of these programs, especially when it comes to mental health stuff, that he's now forever going to be in the system, forever marked. And so that's part of his resistance in even getting financial assistance from the VA or SSI or anything. But she is hopeful with our, with us being involved now, she is hopeful that maybe he will listen to someone other than just her or the VA. She's hopeful he might listen to us.
Casey, it's Lawrence Saavedra again. Have you guys offered NAMI to her? Maybe take a pamphlet about NAMI family to family, so that maybe if they go through that training, it's I don't know how many weeks. I think it's 8 weeks, one night a week. It just teaches the family how to cope with having a family member that's struggling with mental illness. So that might be the best thing that you could do for her, just to give her insight. It's not going to change his behaviors, but she might have better insight. And we can give you flyers for them. I have some at the office that you could hand out to her.
Yeah, I'll definitely I'll do that when we go to visit them. It's a good idea.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for the questions and the input. We intentionally picked a case study today that had nothing to do with our topic of discussion today. Us as a detective team decided we didn't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole, so we just wanted to do something completely unrelated, just because, one, we didn't know a lot about this, and we didn't want to dabble in that. So today I'd like to introduce to everyone Dr. Lisa Herrera. She's a resident physician with the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health Sciences at UNM. And today we're going to be talking about EMTALA regulations with a focus on psychiatric emergency services. And
have a case about this topic because it is a very, in my mind, kind of sticky topic, because it has a lot of interpretation and can be definitely debated through different hospitals. So let me share my screen. Can the host allow me to share my screen? Thank you. Okay. So the acronym EMTALA stands for Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. It is the law that hospitals, specifically emergency departments, follow when it terms into how people are brought into the emergency department, how they're screened and managed going forward. And so the reason why I picked this topic is because in my last month working in psych emergency service, we had a couple of individuals brought to us from various ways that this topic was definitely in discussion, and it definitely makes a difference into how care is delivered. So let me go forward. Within this discussion, I wanted to talk about EMTALA in general, and then within are made up, but definitely ring true, and hopefully you all can provide some feedback in that as well. And hopefully we can have discussion about how different people have had interacted with these cases. So let's start off with case 1. Well-known, and it's known that he also uses methamphetamine. This an interaction with an individual like this.
Probably just today.
Yeah. Do you mind sharing with us what kind of happened for this individual?
No, that was a joke. I'm sorry, but in the past, I have had that in the past where we've taken somebody there that met the requirements per state law to be transported for an emergency mental health evaluation. That we know that they abuse drugs, but they also have an underlying mental health issue. And we've taken them and they don't stay very long, if they stay at all.
Yeah.
And it's very frustrating on our side to take that person when they meet the state requirement, but they don't appear to have what it takes for you guys to keep them.
Yeah, do you mind if we spend a little bit of time talking about what you mean by the state requirement? Are you referring to him endorsing suicidality, him endorsing hearing voices?
What the state law 431-10 states is if someone is because of a mental illness poses a likely threat that they could hurt themselves or others, that can be by words or actions, that you should take them to a mental health facility for an evaluation. So that's what I mean when I say they've met the statutory requirement for us to take them to you.
Okay, and I appreciate you sharing that in more detail. Thank you. Anyone else have a situation where an individual like this has had a different outcome? Okay, so in our setting, me speaking as a psychiatric resident, this is a case very well known to us, and because sometimes it's very well known, frustration and tensions can be raised. So I'm going to add a little bit of humor to the situation to hopefully kind of diffuse and allow us to discuss a little bit more. So let's talk about EMTALA. It's a federal law. It was purposely brought up so hospitals wouldn't just refuse to see individuals based on their inability to pay, based on whatever insurance plan they did or did not have. And it's been enacted for quite a number of years, and it's had some updates within the last 2 decades by Medicare and Medicaid services based on a study that they did to try to involve HIPAA regulations in that as well. Often, because it's individuals coming in to get services, this law is highly discussed and thought of in emergency care services. And so when you had mentioned, is it Detective or Sergeant Saavedra? I apologize.
Just detective, thanks.
Chief Detective. When Chief Detective had mentioned the law.
I said just detective, not chief, sorry.
Yeah.
I can't be giving myself a raise here, sorry.
Okay. When Detective Saavedra had mentioned the severity in regards to being brought into emergency services, often people, you know, when we file a chief complaint, they may come into your care stating, harm to self or others. And then for whatever reason, by the time they meet us, their chief complaint to us is, I just want a sandwich and a place to sleep. So that may play into this role as well. I see something in the comments. I'm trying to get that as well. Chief Detective Better. Okay. So let's talk about what a psych emergency service is. And I apologize, I went ahead. There we go. Okay, by EMTALA, it is discussing the severity of a symptom, and this also includes pain. It discusses the severity of the outcome of the disease process, whether it will cause harm to an individual, and this even includes an unborn child, or aspects of bodily function. So it's a pretty broad definition of what an emergency is. And good thing, because oftentimes, when you just hear a one-line statement of an individual, you can't necessarily understand what is going on to cause these processes. So within EMTALA, it has a hospital requirement that individuals have to be medically screened to see if there's an emergency medical condition. If there is an emergency medical condition, the hospital is required to be able to either stabilize or to refer out to other hospitals. That means that if a hospital, in the case of specialty care like cardiology, if the hospital doesn't have the means to be able to stabilize or resolve, the hospital has to make arrangements to be able to get that care for that individual. And as a specialty care hospital, that means that that specialty hospital has to be able to receive those transfers. And similarly in psychiatry is thought of as a specialty care unit. So hospitals like MHC, hospitals like Haven, et cetera, those would be the specialty care hospitals for a psychiatric setting.
Can I ask a quick question about that?
Of course.
So it states that they have to be transferred. Who's responsible for that transfer though? If
That
we
would-
take them to you, are we responsible, or since we've crossed your threshold, are you responsible?
Once the medical screening exam has been done, that's when the hospital requires transfer to a place. And that's based on the determination from that medical screening exam that there's an emergency in place and the hospital therefore needs to take kind of care and process to do that transfer.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So it's a big deal because there's a lot of penalties for violating EMTALA, not only just for the hospital, the institution, but even individuals. If they are found to violate EMTALA, fines can happen. Even civil suits can happen based on injury done from refusing to see someone based on the EMTALA regulation. So that is why documentation, specifically that medical screening exam, is important. And like always in your field as well, sometimes, it's really important just to be able to describe what's going on, even if the etiology isn't quite clear. It's definitely challenging in regards to various chief complaints of whether it's a pain or a social situation. So that is one of the reasons why I and many of my colleagues like direct quotes to be able to kind of just, place in the documentation what exactly is the chief concern in place and trying to figure out where are we coming from. So now I'm going to segue into EMTALA specifically in the psychiatric realm. Before we do that, any questions about what we've reviewed thus far? Nope. Okay, moving on. So here's another case. It's a 46-year-old female. She has the diagnosis of bipolar affective disorder. She calls 911 from her group home because she says that her roommates are trying to kill her. The group home manager has informed you all that she's not been taking her medication, and she's actually been verbally aggressive towards others in the group home. First off, has anyone had a situation like this, and then what happened?
Detective Mike Cirillo, APD. This is a fairly common call. Police respond if, if they deem that that person's not an actual threat to themselves or others in the group home setting. There's really not much to do. If they do breach that threshold, then they get taken to the hospital. From there, if it's a group home, usually someone from the group home has to be there to assist.
Okay. Any other situations that have kind of come out from this setting? Okay.
Well, hold on. I've had one where we ended up at the group home talking, and what we had to do is clarify with the caretakers when they said what she's being verbally aggressive. It was actually a he, verbally aggressive. What did that entail? And in this case, it was threatening behavior and saying that, when someone wasn't watching, he was going to take stuff into his own hands. And so to me, that made it, once again, where it met that statutory requirement. And yeah, this person needs to be taken in for the evaluation. It could go the other way though, where you're talking to the caretaker and it's just what they're seeing as aggressive but not threatening behavior, something that's not going to meet that threshold for danger to themselves or others. And then that's when you just try to treat them and leave them at home or in the setting that they're in.
Okay. Thank you. I saw something in the chat, and it's a little challenging for me to be able to read it while I'm in this view. Does someone mind reading?
Yes, Doctor. It's from Sergeant Block. He says, honestly, without an overt ability to carry out a threat, we can't do much.
Okay. Can you clarify that a little bit, Sergeant Black?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm sorry. I probably got background noise just while I'm muted. I guess what I'm trying to point out for the group is that in the field, we really need to be able to articulate in our reports that there's some kind of ability for that person to carry out whatever threat they're making. And so there's a lot of times that we will get threats that sound threatening, but when the officer goes and they do their investigation, there really is no ability for that person to carry out the threat. It's more words than anything else. And it kind of takes away our ability to take them for a mental health evaluation. Not completely, as Chief Detective was saying, but a little bit.
Okay, that's helpful for me to know. Thank you, sir.
Sorry, Rob Garnand with the Crisis Intervention Unit. Back on that slide, I think there's some key words that are important there. Like they're fearing that their roommates are trying to kill them. So a lot of times we, might be a little bit too rushed to ask those questions about suicidality or homicidality. And those are the only questions we ask. But if someone is so afraid that their roommates are trying to kill them, it's important that if it were me in that situation, I'd be asking like, okay, what would you do to protect yourself? And that's another added layer of protection for the officer to ask that question. Because if that person is in, dire fear of their life, they're going to be doing things to protect themselves. And them laying out the groundwork could be all the difference needed to take somebody to the hospital to get them help.
Right. Yes. Thank you. Again, I see more chats, but I can't read them. Does someone mind?
Yes, Doctor. Lawrence is smack talking a little bit about being chief detective.
Got
and
it.
then Sergeant Block just was reiterating Rob's point.
Okay. All right. Thank you all. Thank you also for contributing to the case discussion as well. So moving on to, based on our literature, what is an acute psychiatric crisis? It can be a little challenging because as Detective, and I'm so sorry, I forgot your name, who had presented the case earlier, had mentioned, oftentimes when there is substances, whether it's alcohol or substances like methamphetamine on board, it can definitely, cloud the picture of, what is the substance versus what is a possibly underlying psychiatric crisis. And the other reason why I bring this up is because it also can differentiate what is the appropriate care. Does an individual need to be medically stabilized before they then go forward and receive certain psychiatric care? Or is this something that can be appropriately dealt with within a psychiatric emergency department like PES, and then go forward from there? And the reason why I clarify that is because not all institutions are the same, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but when there's kind of confounding things like alcohol and other substances, that definitely can start off already determining where this individual needs to receive their care first. And the EMTALA regulations mention that as well. They talk about how sometimes individuals, if they need to come into an emergency department while they're in custody just to receive a BAL, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are then therefore taken on out of police custody to just get that check. Rather, it's a difference whether an individual for their medical safety then needs to be stabilized in emergency departments. And then the EMTALA regulation also talks about in psychiatric emergencies, if an individual expresses suicidal or homicidal ideation, if they are found to be a danger to themselves or others, that is deemed to be an emergency medical condition by EMTALA. So going forward, one of the articles that I referenced mentioned 6 goals of emergency psychiatric care. It talks specifically about how our goals as once we're, in an emergency psychiatric setting, what are the goals to either being stabilized or to resolve a psychiatric issue. Like I said, first off, there needs to be an exclusion of medical etiology for symptoms. And like in the case of alcohol, because an individual can possibly go through serious withdrawal or have seizures, that is something that's not necessarily being able to be managed in a setting like PES because we don't have the medical care to be able to deal with that emergency appropriately. They would then be sent to the main ED in our UNM setting to make sure that they're medically stable before psychiatric situations are further investigated and stabilized. The goals, though, also are to stabilize the acute crisis. Sometimes that's working with various chemical restraints or sometimes physical restraints within a PES setting. Various individuals from the CIT team, I'm sure, have been probably part of that situation as well, where I know in the setting of PES, sometimes it's not safe for an individual to be out of custody yet because we don't have the means to be able to quite stabilize them yet within that acute crisis, especially if agitation and aggression are part of that picture. Our goal is to avoid coercion as in any medical encounter and then treat with the least restrictive means. That's also a situation that can come into situations in regards to discharging plans. And we can talk about that in a little bit more. Within all these acute crises, like for yourselves, we're trying to build rapport. We're trying to build that therapeutic relationship and alliance. And then, like I had mentioned, even from the beginning, the thoughts of, what are the aftercare plans need to be kind of thought of in this situation. Any comments on that before we move forward? I think I saw something in the chat. I'm not sure.
Just how we upgraded Sergeant Block one time in one of our trainings to lieutenant.
Okay. Oh, and I saw Detective Bailey, your name now. I'm sorry that I had missed your name before. So
I may have, I'm sorry, I may have sent something in the chat, but I was just responding to Dr. Martin. Sorry if I interrupted.
no problem at all. What I was trying to say, Detective Bailey, was that in the case that you had presented, oftentimes it's a little bit confusing if there's an underlying psychiatric situation going on, especially if various substances are playing a large part of the picture. So then going forward to talk about different psychiatric services. So the article, again, that I'm quoting mentions various types of services that have been found throughout the US, but I'm going to try to identify, at least from my understanding, what the various services are available within the Albuquerque area, because they're definitely different. So some functions have a hospital that's a sole operation. It can manage and treat psychiatric emergencies. And from what I understand, Haven is kind of a scenario like that. They're a freestanding hospital. They have the means to be able to manage not only psych emergencies, but then kind of access within their inpatient care there. Then there's emergency outpatient programs, which the article mentions that some PES services are actually like that. For our UNM PES service, we're tied to MHC, which is our mental health center, that we have access to an inpatient hospitalization from PES, but we also are unique in regards to we work with the UNM ED for medical stabilization, like I had mentioned before. And then there are other regional dedicated psychiatric emergency programs, which I'm not quite familiar that we have here in Albuquerque, but there are other programs within the US that these programs do exist. So overall, as I'm kind of just running through the rest of the humor, the main purpose of this presentation was to talk about that within your scope of being able to bring in an individual to seek emergency care. I'm sure that there are situations where, like you've mentioned, that you bring in the individual for emergency evaluation, and then before you know it, they're discharged, they're back on the streets, they're back home, and it kind of seems like the situation hasn't quite resolved itself. I wanted to touch briefly on a couple of reasons why that may have been the case, in the sense of the role of EMTALA, specifically in regards to individuals that have then needed to be transferred to an emergency care setting to get medically stabilized, versus settings where, you know, they may have endorsed acuity to you all, and then by the time they come to psychiatric emergency evaluation, something has changed where the stressor is gone, their presentation is different. And I wanted not only to kind of present what was our kind of law that we're going about with, but also try to facilitate a discussion of, you know, where the confusion might be between both of us working together. Any thoughts or comments on that?
I have a question then. Can you, when you guys, I don't know how to put this one, I'm going to try to tread delicately here. But if somebody is in, they haven't been accepted by you all yet, they're just in the triage portion of it.
Yeah.
And they're still presenting the same way. I'm bringing up a video that I had to watch to help an officer. They had a very violent presentation the whole time through, and were even cursing at staff. And then they were released, not even taken in for the eval. They were released prior to entering the facility, or refused service. Is it possible to do that evaluation that quickly, to say, yeah, this person
Yeah, as a resident, often when like I'm in PES, I usually have kind of an attending making that determination. When it comes to psychiatric emergencies, the medical screening exam can be done that quickly within even like the Sally port or within like the lobby, if that's kind of what you're referring to. And ultimately, like I had mentioned earlier in the presentation, it essentially kind of determines like, is there a medical emergency in place? Is there a psychiatric emergency in place in regards to harm to self or others? And from what I'm understanding, possibly reading between the lines, that may be kind of a different interpretation from what you all as law enforcement deem than from what we as psychiatric care deem as well. Is that kind of more on par with what you're saying?
Yeah, pretty much. We're seeing dangerousness and threats and possibility that someone's going to get harmed. And then we take them to the hospital, and that's the same way they're presenting, is they're threatening staff and officers and security all at the same time, yet they didn't meet the threshold for you guys to either chemically restrain them. And I understand it's got to be least restrictive, but I was a little concerned with that one. I was like, what? If I can completely understand that you guys may get a different story off of somebody when we bring them to you. But if it's the same, it just was confusing to me as to why they weren't evaluated a little bit further.
Agreed. And unfortunately, I don't know the specifics of that situation either. And it was one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this topic up, because I'm not an expert in this area. I don't have all the answers, but I think it is something worthwhile to keep open discussion about, because there are these situations, like you had mentioned, that it's just not clear of why things occurred the way they did. Thank you for sharing.
And I'm not trying to quarterback you guys. I know you have your lease, you have what you have to do. It just helps when we have an answer to the officers when they come to us and say, because this officer said, what did I do wrong? Did I not articulate it the right way to the staff? You know, and wanted me to actually listen to the correspondence back and forth, not because they were upset. They just said, what did I do wrong? Because I really do feel like this person should have stayed.
Yeah.
You know, and when I couldn't see where, I couldn't see the reasoning. And so that's the only reason why I brought that up. I understand you guys have what you have to do, and that's understandable completely.
Absolutely, and I feel the same way that you all have your responsibilities as well. I'm curious, if it happened at UNM PES, is there a possibility that we can involve Dr. Romero, who's the medical director, in that conversation?
We probably could. We meet with you guys, I think, quarterly, and
Right.
this one probably will come up.
Okay.
Because of, I mean, it was very concerning to us, but I don't want to focus on UNM and what they're doing wrong. You guys are great allies of us, and we work together. It's just, I'm trying to get something. I just want to have an answer for this officer so that they can, you know what I mean? So that it'll make them better next time.
Absolutely, completely understandable, and quite possibly with discussion with Dr. Romero, even though I don't have any answer right now, possibly a review from our end of the individuals that were involved might be able to provide that clarity.
Hey, Dr. Herrera, is it okay if I piggyback on to answer some of these questions?
Of course, Dr. Martin. Thank you for coming on in.
Sure. So, hey, Lawrence. So I know that you know a couple of these things. I do exclusively practice emergency psychiatry, so I can answer like, I think, systematically what's required from an EMTALA perspective. And really, it's only a medical screening evaluation. So as Dr. Herrera was saying, that includes, vital signs, and then it's really up to the provider about how much more, whether or not the patient has a physical exam or they literally get the once over by an ED physician's eyes. And so from hospital to hospital system, that's going to vary. And I think, utilizing New Mexico state law to our benefit can be helpful in these scenarios. So for instance, if an officer brings somebody to any of the ER systems and they're not under custody and they're not under a C4E, and say, the patient readily admits to using methamphetamine, what I've seen happen over at least the pandemic is that the ER physicians are much, much more reticent to use force and expose an entire staff, usually, a couple of nurses and security, to the potential for an infected COVID person. Because as you guys know, these patients, especially those who are agitated for any variety of reasons, they're not quietly agitated, they're spitting, they're coughing, they're very difficult to restrain. And so Detective Mieta and I have talked with at least the Presbyterian system, and the ERs are much, much less likely to use force during the pandemic because the risk and benefit is just not there. So I think officers are seeing that. They're seeing people turned away, and that's frustrating, but I think the ER providers are really trying to balance that. Do we risk exposing an entire group of ER providers to restrain this person just so that they can metabolize something? And yes, there's an assumption at times, and it's at times unfair assumption that there's substance use. So that's one thing if somebody's coming in without a certificate for evaluation. Now, every system, again, answers the certificate for evaluation differently. The state law is relatively obscure about this, but if somebody presents on a certificate for evaluation, they do have to have psychiatric evaluation. Some ER providers will think they are perfectly qualified to provide that clearance, and some do not. So within the Presbyterian system, if a patient comes in on a certificate for evaluation, our BH team does have to weigh in. But again, that's different from ER system to ER system. But if we're purely speaking about EMTALA, it's just a medical screening evaluation to meet that standard of medical legal requirement.
Thank you, Dr. Martin.
So can I ask a question then by what you've just said then? If we have something that's marginal, like say in our minds it's MET 43-110, but we have access to a clinician, would it be better to have the C4E?
I think it's tricky, but yes, it is a different threshold. It's much, much different for us to be discharging somebody who's on a certificate for evaluation without inherently having more time to observe them, right? Because if someone's on a certificate for evaluation, our standard of care is to call the person who issued it, or at least try to call the person who issued it to try and figure out what's going on. So I think it buys you extra time. If we're getting into tricky territory, if the person's not meeting the C4E criteria and they're being placed on the C4E out of knowledge that the BH team will have to evaluate, that's trickier. But yeah, at least with Presbyterian, that's the workaround. And certainly the cases that you guys are bringing in, we're in the subspecialized group right now. I know